My name is Michael Gaia, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Join me there at Velina Tchakarova. Velina, I think you and I spoke briefly on a space in the past, but I don't know too much about you. So introduce yourself to the audience and to me. Who are you? What's your background? How'd you get involved, interested in geopolitics, and where are you based?
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you to all of you who have joined us and will stay with us for the next hour. My name, as you've heard, is Velina Tchakarova. I'm originally from Bulgaria. I was born actually in Bulgaria and was raised there during the Cold War, and to have the luxury, if one would say so, to draw a direct experience from the two worlds, as I've spent the last 20 plus years in the West. I got my education from Germany. I'm an Austrian citizen. This is very much possible within the European Union to have different mentalities and identities. And I have more than 20 years of academia and professional background in the world of politics, mostly geopolitics. As the last 5 years, specifically, I've been in charge of one of the few security and defense think tanks in Austria dealing with exactly the questions that right now are the most urgent ones, not only in Europe, but obviously in the world, and consulting, obviously, institutions, the government, and so on. And since the start of this year, I've launched my own geopolitical consultancy, and I work with private clients, with hedge fund investors, but also with institutions and governmental representatives on exactly these issues, mostly working with the long-term horizon. That means geopolitical risks, trends, scenarios for the future, and trying to identify the most, let's say, plausible and possible ones, so that obviously my clients are best prepared to navigate in this complexity. And probably the last sentence on my side, I'm also part of Nassim Taleb's team on the Real World Risk Institute, the best-selling author of Black Swan and Anti-Fragile. Obviously, I also very much apply his way of thinking on geopolitical risks and trends.
I was unaware of the Nassim Taleb link. I'm a big fan of his. He and I had a little bit of a respectful back and forth. It was something I posted last year, but I'm trying to get him on one of these spaces. But that's interesting to know. Okay, since you mentioned the academia side, I'm going to assume, like most domains, there's a disconnect between academia and real life. So in the domain of geopolitics, what does academia get right and wrong in terms of how it frames the way the world works?
Well, I wouldn't use this space discussion to bash academia right now, but in fact, I've went through the whole spectrum of international relations, international security, and political science, with the focus specifically on South Asia and international conflicts, to understand the inner workings of the main questions of peace and war. Because still, what most people do not understand is that international relations or let's say global affairs are guided by the very same principles and questions of peace and war as it was the case, let's say 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And we currently deal with a kind of a mantra, or let's say wrong perception, misperception, if you like, that we're living in the most peaceful times ever, that what we have right now, despite all the progress, human progress, scientific progress, is obviously the most prosperous and most sophisticated world. But when it comes to the questions of peace and war, and this is something that is very important also for investors, for people who deal with a lot of money on the financial markets, is to understand that next to other systemic phenomena such as pandemics, as we've seen in the last 2.5 years, the question of peace and war is the other systemic issue that leads to the ruin of states, of institutions, organizations, companies, and so on.
The big difference, of course, between 500 years ago and now is timeframes, right? So increasingly, I think the world moves on a shorter time frame in terms of the way that it thinks about how to operate with its constituents. How do you think about sort of the disconnect between the need for having a long-term view when it comes to dealing with geopolitical factors versus the very short-term demands of voters and those that are trying to just live day to day?
I think that this is the hardest part because most of the people, and I've observed this phenomenon at all layers, be it institutional players, organizations, bureaucrats, administration representatives, decision makers, or even people from the financial world, are very much preoccupied with the short-term window and horizon. And that is very much understandable. So they are pretty much focused on the trees. But in fact, I argue that if one manages, and this is, of course, the big question, how you master the process of understanding the patterns of behavior. And this is something that requires a lot of time. And as I said, I myself have spent more than 20 years and I'm still learning the processes to understand how these patterns of behavior show you a certain projection. So what I do, for instance, is to understand trends projections, risks projections that show us a certain direction. And the direction itself, as well as the processes within certain interactions, be it between state actors, be it between state and non-state actors. This is the story I want to understand rather than the factualities of the daily business, of the daily politics. That means who said what in what kind of framework, right? So the one is important, but it is more important probably for those trading the signals. But I look actually for the strong signals pointing to my trends projections. And of course, obviously, I have to always somehow adjust these trend projections. So if you're interested later, I can also, point to my most important ones in terms of geopolitics.
Okay, so definitely want to get into that. But since I named the space significance of BRICS to dollar hegemony, I mean, one of the longer term trends you can argue is the kind of slow, I hate to use the word term death, but just to make it sound dramatic, the slow death of the dollar as the reserve currency. First of all, do you think that that is a legitimate narrative and trend? I mean, arguably, people have been saying that for a long, long time, and it's hard to unseat sort of King Dollar, I'd argue.
Okay, so when it comes to the big open question of the future role of the dollar, right? We could obviously first and foremost draw certain conclusions based on historical patterns. We know for a fact, and this has been pretty much the cycle of globalization and deglobalization linked also to the rise and fall of global powers for the last 250 years, let's say just the period of the Industrial Revolution, to not go into previous historical periods. And we clearly see that the currency issue is a function of the question of whether a state actor possesses the global power projection capabilities. So that means that right now, as we speak, we have only one sole state actor, and that is the United States, that possesses by all means these global power projection capabilities. That does not necessarily mean only and solely in terms of military power projection. And here, for those who do not understand what it means simply put, the ability to deploy military, let's say, boots on the ground in every more or less spot on the map. But it is not only reduced to that. It is very much also about geoeconomic power projection that is derived from trade flows, from economic connectedness, and obviously also from transactions in these currencies. In order to find an answer to this question, we need to actually follow the projections in terms of the global power projection ability of the United States. And so far, we have competitors. In fact, we have only one sole competitor, and that is China, that has, in fact, already launched its own hybrid approach to global power projection. China is not there yet. We also do not know for a fact whether China will succeed with that. But China is this unique Asian power that pursues a hybrid approach between what Great Britain and later the United States achieved as a Rimland strategy operating in the oceans, and the Soviet Union, which is a classic heartland power, which practically established its supremacy and became superpower based on its control over the largest Eurasian landmass, Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and so on. So China is trying right now a hybrid approach, is the sole competitor. United States is trying to preserve its own supremacy. And here we have probably two possible scenarios in the, let's say, short to medium term. That would mean the next 5 to 10 years to look for. Either we end up with something like Pax Americana 2.0, that would be Cold War 2.0 scenario in which two competitors will compete and United States will emerge victorious, as it did in the first Cold War in the competition with the Soviet Union. Or we may end up also with something very, very different. This means that in finding an answer to this scenario, we will find an answer also to the question of the US dollar supremacy. So right now, as we speak, there is no competition to the US dollar supremacy.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you emphasized the nuance of China as, in quotes, a superpower or not. I did a space yesterday, and that was similar conclusion that the narrative, at least in the West, around China as the competitor, that we have to be worried about China taking over the world in terms of economic influence and military might, is just not the reality.
As I said, both approaches right now, the one being that obviously the United States tries to adapt to the new realities, to forge new partnerships, new alliances, in order to also prepare for such competition if it happens. And the second being obviously linked to this Asian unique, as I said, hybrid approach of, on the one hand, establishing supremacy in the direct maritime vicinity. Think of South China Sea, think of East China Sea, in the Indo-Pacific Ocean region, with the Indian Ocean, but also the Eurasian landmass with the help of Russia. So this is going to be the Chinese effort. It's going to happen in this decade, and we don't know the exact answer to these efforts. So we don't know whether China will be successful in these endeavors. We don't also know exactly how the United States will be successful with its own adaptation to the new geopolitical realities. So this all has its own big question mark. And as I said, all the relevant questions such as financial supremacy or technological supremacy, think of the fourth industrial revolution that is happening right now. Once again, we see two clear competitors that try to get the most out of it, to get the most technological breakthroughs. We already see a kind of escalation in this competition in various domains. And this has a lot of good news for, let's say, investors, because a lot of these domains will witness revolutionary steps forward, a lot of progress, scientific progress specifically. But at the very same time, we are going to see also a lot of competition that has negative nuance, and that is that there cannot be two winners. And obviously the one riding the wave of the technological revolution will be also the one getting the benefits of it and imposing the new rules of the game.
Now, one thing arguably that's changed obviously a lot the last decade or two is the sort of co-movement or relationships of not just the US to China, but China to Russia, India, and Brazil, going back to the BRICS acronym. Maybe lay out for the audience the evolution of the relationships of the different countries to each other, because I think this ultimately does also impact the view of a challenge to the US?
So first, I have been following most of these BRICS summits. I'm really delighted that now there are so many people actually getting interested in these developments, because it was quite of a small community following the developments around the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the BRICS Forum. So all of these formats, first and foremost, specifically the BRICS, because you asked about it, These are not institutionalized formats the way we understand in the West. You have like institutionalized organization with all of the specific structures and so on and so forth. Second, they have been here with us like forever, like the last 20 years, for instance, the BRICS specifically is such an example. And very few people were paying attention, which also comes to show that a lot. The perception right now is different as compared to, let's say, 15 years ago when the first summit happened. And I was going through some of the pictures from previous summits, like the one in 2015 in Russia, where you would see the same people standing at the table, obviously with Xi Jinping, with Vladimir Putin, also with PM Modi. But also what was really interesting was that the guy serving the dishes was, in fact, Prigozhin, who the famous, Wagner PMC, a leader who just died in a plane crash a few days ago. And here, what you need to understand is, first and foremost, this is not a homogeneous block or format. The way, for instance, we understand such blocks or formats in the West. In the West, you obviously have different groupings. And most of these groupings are actually built on shared trust or shared values, or even, if you like, shared goals and vision for the future. So take, for instance, the G7, take NATO as, for instance, the defense alliance of the West. You have very different formats, and most of them are really centered around a core idea and shared, as I said, interests, visions, goals, and so on and so forth. Here, we have two clear regional competitors. These are China and India. They have been involved previously in military tensions along the common border. They have been engaged in a war back in the 60s. They have unresolved territorial issues, water disputes, so on and so forth. So you obviously see that BRICS having these two Asian giants, which will very much dominate the global affairs in this and in the next decade, specifically because of what I've already outlined with regards to China. But also what I need to highlight for you with regards to India is that India will have probably the most successful geopolitical and geoeconomic story in this decade in terms of positive demographic trends, in terms of positive economic growth trends, in terms of quite, let's say, stable political elites. And all of these put together will result in a very ambitious international exposure of India. And if you add to it the very fact that India will once again be in the middle between two rivaling formations, on the one hand led by the United States and on the other hand led by China, you clearly understand why India makes sure to be part of such formations, such as BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So here it is really the national interest behind it, the geopolitical interest behind it, not so much a shared vision where India would like to, let's say, be on the same page with China. When it comes to Russia, here, of course, the story is very different. Now, think of Russia as the power that, in the words of the Russian president, has witnessed the biggest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. That obviously was the collapse of the Soviet Union, has still the mindset of a superpower, but has to realize that meanwhile it is great power with significant nuclear arsenal, with significant regional power projection. I can explain in which specific areas and domains, but at the very same time, Russia, of course, understands the new realities, the new game. And the way Russia sees itself is as this wild card between two rivals, where the participation on behalf of the one or the other competitor will turn the equation, maybe similar to what we've observed in the 70s, when suddenly the Soviet Union and China were in this, let's say, quite precarious conflict, and the United States used the opportunity to turn them against each other by luring the one of them, which in this case was China. So Russia sees itself already in this kind of position. At the very same time, Russia's main goal is still to erode the American influence in all possible ways, not only in all these various important fields, but also in terms of international and regional organizations. And here, what also is the Russian main goal is to prevent any possible isolation. Because as we speak, this is the second round of Western isolation, not the first. The first came in 2014 when the first invasion of Ukraine happened. So Russia learned a lesson, and organizations such as BRICS specifically give Russia the entry ticket to country clubs, which will prevent this international isolation. Final point, BRICS is also used, let's say, as an anti-Western narrative, specifically by China and Russia, when dealing with countries in the so-called Global South. Right now, the Global South is a collective term for those countries in between that are positioned in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So very similar to the first Cold War. This is going to be the most competed terrain for the indirect competition over the hearts and minds. So here, once again, we see that each of the players pursue obviously very different motivation. For Brazil and South Africa as being representatives of the Global South, this is a so-called access to the first tier players.
In the announcement of the space yesterday, there were a few people that had commented to your question about what should we cover. And I'll go through a couple of these. Again, if anybody wants to come up and ask questions, click that bottom left mic request button. But Randall Gates yesterday asked the question of how serious a threat are the BRICS to the U.S. economy, especially from a commodity standpoint. This is always something that is, I think, an interesting thing in the background as far as reliance by the U.S. when it comes to raw materials. But are the concerns well-founded there? And if they are, have they maybe lessened over time?
If we were still in the scenario of Cold War, of the traditional Cold War that we've seen, probably we may argue that this would be a very serious, let's say, issue, a very serious threat. But right now, the United States is a very different geopolitical player than it was before. The United States has become energy superpower, and obviously, yes, is still reliant on energy supply from outside, but it's a very different story from the situation, the dependence that the United States had on energy supply, let's say, back during the Cold War. This is the first. The second, of course, it's about food commodities. Here, once again, we know for a fact that the United States is agricultural superpower. As seen from the sole American perspective, I would argue that this formation represents by no means a realistic threat in the short term. But here, I have to also point to the realities in terms of projections. Why should we be cautious? Since that the United States cannot act on its own. It is very much dependent on the own alliances and partnerships, on the way how partners and allies thrive or are, let's say, threatened by certain realities. For instance, in terms of supply chains, in terms of dependencies that weaken their GDP or strengthen their geoeconomic exposure. And here I see the main issue, and that is the issue that BRICS consists not only of, let's say, oil suppliers that are significant for the global energy markets, but also, meanwhile, food suppliers, food producers and exporters that are significant for the global food markets. So this, of course, could be a narrative in the future where we may see a kind of a new, similar to what OPEC was in the 70s during the first Cold War, a new kind of geopolitical role for this formation, if we assume that they would act in a coherent manner as a unified bloc, which, as I already highlighted, is certainly not the case as of today. But what we could argue as of now is that they obviously use these opportunities to create a certain narrative that their voice needs to be heard more often. Think also of the upcoming G20 summit in India next week, and it's going to be very similar narrative. So that these regional players, some call them, except for China, and the swing states, key players that obviously are going to hedge between United States and China. And by doing so, this will, of course, create certain impact, geopolitical and geoeconomic one. So here the narrative is that they want to create not necessarily an anti-Western or anti-American narrative, but they want to create a narrative for themselves that their voice needs to be heard more often, that they have more significant impact on global affairs, and so on and so forth.
Another question from that post you put out there yesterday: Turkey-Russia relations, the future of the former Soviet bloc nations, depending upon the possible Ukraine conflict's outcomes. Now, this is obviously very complex, but any kind of thoughts on that side of things?
Okay, for instance, I will actually outline my key three scenarios on Russia's war against Ukraine. Very shortly before that, I tend to use the example of the Russian-Turkish relations as a very, very, very good example from the world of realpolitik. Two traditional and, in fact, natural rivals in the wider Black Sea area. At the very same time, they coordinate and cooperate on various topics for the sake of their own national interests. So what I'm trying to tell you by giving you this example is that this is, in fact, the real world. It's very nuanced. You don't have this either or and these maximum gain scenarios. You always have a kind of nuanced environment in which more or less each of the actors has to arrive at some kind of solution. Turkey is a key US ally, in fact, strategic ally in the Black Sea area, in Europe, bridging Europe with Asia. And this is going to remain as a key factor in the US politics, no matter what. A lot of people have been telling us for, let's say, the last couple of years because of the deteriorated relationship between Erdogan and, let's say, US administration. And at the very same time, as we've seen also during the war, Erdogan was, in fact, one of the few political leaders who was able to mediate between Ukraine and Russia in one of the key, in fact, domains, which is food commodities. In fact, the Black Sea Grain Initiative that was agreed last year in July would not have been possible without Erdogan's mediation, and obviously also with the help of the UN. So the upcoming meeting is very important for the sake of the prolongation of the initiative, because otherwise we may see food crisis 2.0 emerging, even though that markets are not factoring it right now. But I argue that given the fact that Black Sea is the key wheat global choke point, one of the most important global choke points for food commodities in general, if the withdrawal of Russia from the initiative continues, that means if the initiative continues to be blocked and at the same time ports in the Danube area are continuously attacked by missiles, rocket missiles and drones, this is the alternative for the Ukrainian agricultural products. A lot of these countries that are dependent on Ukrainian agricultural products, because Ukrainian is a significant agricultural powerhouse, a significant exporter for some of these commodities, this may lead to, as I said, similar to what happened last year after March scenario. Now, when it comes to the general scenarios on Russia's war against Ukraine, right now we have three particular scenarios as outlined for the last 18 months. Obviously, right now we are in a scenario of war of attrition or a kind of a stalemate. On the one hand, because the West has been too slow in delivering what it has pledged and promised. In fact, only 50% of what has been promised this year has been delivered to Ukraine. And of course, the lack of sufficient military aid. led to the slowing down of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, you need to understand that these counteroffensives are possible only in a certain time frame because of the weather conditions. At the same time, Russia skillfully adjusted to the new realities in a sense that it has fortified its defense lines, and specifically in the illegally occupied Ukrainian territories. As we speak, Russia controls around 18% of the Ukrainian territory. And at the same time, it has mined a lot of these territories. So it has made it much more difficult for Ukraine to conduct successful counteroffensives. And the third important variable in this scenario of a war of attrition is that because of countries such as China, India, Iran, Turkey, UAE, and so on, in fact, Russia has successfully bypassed the sanctions regimes in various domains and was not internationally isolated. So what would be two other possible projections from the current one is that we may witness a scenario of another frozen conflict, as we've seen many of these frozen conflicts since the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is obviously quite beneficial to the Russian geopolitical interests, and it would legitimize indirectly these illegally occupied territories. It will put obviously also pressure on Ukraine, given the changing political environment in the West. Think of the upcoming US elections. And we already observed that the mood in the US society is changing, very often due to the lack of information, I must say, but also because the main focus will be put on domestic issues, understandably. The other option, and that is the option that should not be neglected, we've seen with the mutiny 2 months ago by Prigozhin. We've seen now also with what happened following the plane crash of the Wagner political leadership, that there may be a political struggle behind the curtains. We don't have enough information. Russia is a closed political box. So here, that may be a black swan. It could result in a kind of unexpected political reshuffle in the Kremlin. It could also be a tipping point in terms of military developments or, let's say, economic scenario. But obviously, a scenario in which Ukraine wins, conducts successful counteroffensive, has a military breakthrough as it happened last year, is also on the table.
Speaking of the U.S. elections, do you get a sense that any major policy changes would be in the pipeline if Republican ends up taking the White House?
That's not my expertise. I usually refrain from giving opinions which are not based on expertise. The one thing that I can tell you is that Europeans sitting in political cabinets and in key institutions in Europe are already worried about the possible scenario of a Republican president coming to power in the United States, similarly to what happened when Trump came to power.
What are some of the less reported geopolitical trends that you're seeing that will become bigger deals in terms of just headlines, things that you're observing that are underappreciated?
The first being the big academia, but also at the level of experts, debate about the future global order, where the majority, almost everyone, is screaming about the next multipolarity. And I belong to a very small corner of people who argue that we may face actually a global system bifurcation, that our system, the way we've seen it over the last 30 years, may split into two major systems being controlled and facilitated by both United States and China. And this is something that keeps me awake in the night, because we've never, ever in the past had this kind of interconnectedness at the level of the global affairs. So we don't know, in fact, how this opposite process will look like, what the outcome of this will be. Not only the entanglement between United States and China. So that means not only the systemic decoupling, but also in general, what it will mean for the rest of the world. That's the one thing that I really miss in debates, discussions, and so on and so forth. And that has helped me navigate correctly with my assessments quite a lot over the last 15 years. The second is the modus vivendi of coordination between China and Russia. Now, everyone talks about it as if it's the most obvious thing. But in fact, I've been arguing that since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, one of the most overlooked phenomena and processes in the world of geopolitics has been the emergence of this modus vivendi of coordination between China and Russia. Why would I like it to be covered more extensively? For an obvious reason, and that is that China and Russia share a similar feature, and that is that they are both closed boxes, closed systems. We have very little to no information. What's really going on there in terms of political leadership, in terms of political decision making. So here, this kind of modus vivendi of coordination, the so-called dragon bear, if you like, what I've coined, similar to the term BRICS, in order to follow the trends and the developments in the various domains, from commodities and energy to technology and defense to space to regional and international organizations. So there, the projections are they speak very clear language. And that is that this coordination, it's not a strategic alliance, it's not a military entente, it's nothing what we understand in the West. But it is something that has been growing consistently, has been deepening consistently. And right now with this war that Russia has been waging on Ukraine, I argue that one possible scenario would be that this war turns into a proxy war in which both United States and China would take the detrimental position of supporting either Ukraine or Russia.
This may sound like a naive question, but this is not a part of the world that I know too much about from a profession perspective. But what makes for a good geopolitical strategist? I mean, it's got to be more than just framework or how things end up playing out. It's just like everything else, right? You've got a business, you're putting yourself out there, your name, your knowledge. What makes you different compared to others that are in the space?
Well, first, I think is if you have been more successful in terms of assessing certain developments correctly. If you have a track record of correctly evaluating systemic processes and developments, I think that this is one way how I would put it. Credibility that is derived from the way you actually, outline the reality for others to understand it. The problem here is that most of these assessments are not being made public for various reasons. These are layers of decision making that often, that are often conducted behind the curtains. You operate with a lot of information that it's not shareable. A lot of what actually is happening in the real world is based on a via negativa. That means that you don't have any information or no credible information, which is actually the purpose of state actors. So when they pursue their interests, they do not want their rivals to know what is exactly at stake or what the exact purpose is. So a lot of these assessments have to witness the scrutiny of time.
Yeah, no, I think that's well taken. Again, it's just not a part of the world that I'm familiar with, just from a profession standpoint. Going back to a couple of these questions that are getting posted here. Adam Payne asking the question, as technology shrinks the world, do you think at some point the world will utilize one universal, in quote, system? And if so, do you think it'll be one of the existing systems or something new, not currently in existence?
My short answer will be no. I mean, we won't see a unilateral or unified singular system that delivers for everyone, for every state actor, no matter which kind of global order will evolve from now on. As I said, whether we will end up with Pax Americana 2.0 or we will end up with the bifurcated world in which two systems will coexist with all their relevant supply chains and technologies and closed internet spaces and new Star Wars programs and all of the rest of what we've seen in the Cold War context. But even in a multipolar world, which is right now the main narrative, once again, there will be a lot of different narratives, a lot of different approaches and answers to the very same questions. And here, once again, there will be a lot of competition and a lot of hedging, by the way. So in the end, it is still about the main question, and that is who is on the top, who actually imposes the main rules of the game. Think of the narrative that is propagated right now about rules-based order versus, if you like, China-led order. So these are the issues that make me think that we won't end up with anything unifying all of the actors. Thank you very much, Piotr. I will start with the second question, which outlines the technicalities of the current situation, and that is that China, and by extension also India, has all these issues with their own currencies, with the capital controls, and so on and so forth. So obviously, the conditions for, let's say, opening up a new financial system that would be an alternative to the existent one are not in place. But as I said, we should be cautious. We should just follow the developments, specifically the solutions proposed by the one or the other in terms of how new mechanisms will emerge, what kind of mechanisms. But as we speak right now, the conditions are not in place. So we don't have any technical solutions on behalf of China, mostly on behalf of China, to actually speed up the process in which, let's say, yuan as a currency will be more traded, more often traded, or whatsoever. We've seen this, by the way, also in the relationship between Russia and China, where Russia had to, in fact, trade a lot with China in the Chinese currency, and they're facing issues because of the trade imbalances. And same goes actually for the trade account with India, where, as we speak right now, as I found out a few days ago when I was preparing an article for Attica, for Dr. Haji, that almost 40 billion US dollars are stuck in Indian banks because of that, in the bilateral trade between Russia and India from the last year, so from the beginning of the war until now. Regarding the second question, I wouldn't describe the choice of Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and UAE as a random choice. We've seen a lot of efforts on behalf of China to stabilize the Middle East, which is now actually defined as West Asia. That tells you already a lot how the region is perceived in the grand ambitions of players like China, but also India and Russia. And a lot of good things will happen in the future, specifically in this region. So not everything is bad. When I talk about competition, for instance, we just don't have the time to address these issues, but there will be also a lot of positive developments because of this competition, because now a lot of key regions, such as the one that actually hosts Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran, they will witness a lot of competition on behalf of United States and China. And that means that these countries will have more options on the ground. So the North African, West Asian angle is by no means coincidence in the choice out of 40 members. About Indonesia, yes, there has been a lot of speculation that Indonesia would be a natural fit to join the BRICS, but probably, and obviously Indonesia will be one of the members of the future G7, because the future G7 will actually entail a lot of Asian countries. But here, probably it's once again a cautious oscillation between the two important players and the two important blocks, because right now we have also a lot going on in terms of ASEAN, in terms of the Indo-Pacific formations. And probably I would argue that Indonesia just decided to skip this round and observe what's happening next. We have, as I said, G20 summit. So obviously I wouldn't exclude Indonesia in the future.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, just I was saying if you can just for those that want to get more involved with following your work, where would you point them to?
Yes. So you can follow me on Twitter, obviously. You can also subscribe to my weekly free newsletter on foraconsciousexperience.com. This is my webpage. And then you can find out more about my work, my different products. And feel free to reach out.
Good place to wrap this conversation up. Again, folks, this will be an edited podcast under Lead Lag Live. I'm having one more space, literally in about 3 minutes, so stay tuned for that. And thank you, Velina. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Cheers, everybody.